Hi. I've mentioned Niccolo Machiavelli before, and that's person. No, the work from that person is what fascinates me. His book, The Prince. In my opinion, it's a very raw and unedited description of the mechanism of power, how to gain power and maintain power. In his book, which is very short, less than 100 pages, everything is presented concisely, raw, and just brutally honest. From the time of when he was in the political, when he mingled around with the elites of Florence during the Renaissance. Now, the Medicis were the bosses of Florence, and they got taken away by the Republicans. Now that's when Niccolo Machiavelli got into the seats of power somehow, and eventually the Medicis came back, so they crushed their enemies. Niccolo Machiavelli's life was spared, so he was exiled from Florence. The theory goes, one theory is that this book is a kind of a manual, a guide for the Medici in power, of how a prince or a leader, should maintain his power and gain power through historical examples and so on and so on. However, there is another version to it too, another theory which says that this book was kind of written for the people. Now, imagine this. Today, it's easy to realize that you can start a channel on YouTube, for example, do some presentation, share your opinions, and it can spread around pretty big. Now, in that time, in the medieval time, how could you spread your ideas? Most people couldn't read or write. It was something that clerics did, and I just having the paper and material to write and the time for it. So what I'm saying is, it's obvious that he had to dedicate the book to the Medicis as a cover, like, this book is for you, here's the content, it might help you. Now, the book was rejected, he never got back into the seat of power, and he lived out his life. He was a family man, he was also very immoral, cheated on his wife, went to prostitutes and so on. However, I still think this book was dedicated to the people based on what he had seen, how power works. And this book has inspired leaders, generals, politicians, psychopaths, and researchers, philosophers for centuries. It really describes the mechanism very well. So the tools change. Back in the days when you took over something, you had to kill the whole family basically, because you don't want any revenge. That's the way it was done. Today it's more of a kind of a sneaky approach, economical warfare, although we do have perpetual wars today, so more people are killed today than back in those times. So some things were bloodier then, some things are bloodier now, but the tools, the approach changes, the mechanism stays the same. That's what is keeping this book alive, and you should read it, or you can listen to it. I'll leave the link below to the LibriVox. They have public domain books where people basically read, like, somebody can read it, or maybe a group of people read a book that's 600 pages. So anyway, a free audio library of public domain works. So to get back to this theory that the book was for the public, of course he's another example of somebody who died not knowing what would happen. He couldn't have guessed that his name would become a definition of something, a Machiavellian rule, a Machiavellian type, a Machiavellian twist. It has a meaning in itself. So after his death, the book began to spread around. It was banned among many, how do you say, like principalities. Of course, the Roman Church banned it, and as you know, throughout the centuries, in that time, people probably took inspiration from it, the leaders. But the public shared the book, and this is what it's very interesting, in my opinion, that the public shared the book, and those few who could read could probably talk about it, read it out loud to other people. As I said, today it's easy to share your idea, but back in those days, people didn't even have pen and paper. So the intention was to, how do you say, show how power works, so that the people can recognize what is happening right now. Why is my leader doing this? Is this situation a false flag, or is it not? So there are many classic examples. Let's say, you know, there's a protest or uprising against the leader. Now that leader takes the opportunity. He might have created that uprising himself to eliminate all the opponents. So the whole uprising was a setup for him or her to strengthen their power. And there are many other examples which are classic, which you can just see now if you go and scroll through media sites, I mean news sites and so on. You can pinpoint what's going on. So that's my, okay, nobody knows why he wrote the book, but I think that makes sense. I don't think a man of such capacity would have been so naive to think the Medicis would have taken him back after, you know, he kind of betrayed them. His life was spared and he was exiled. So now, this book is something I think schools, educational systems should have, must have, ought to have. I will introduce my kids to this book when they start to think about, where does money come from? Why are there laws? Who's the boss around here? Oh, there are many bosses. Who decides who's boss in this country, and so on. So because it is so brutally honest and to the point, it is not a shortcut in a negative sense, but it's like a flyover. Imagine, I mean, I can remember what I learned in school. It was all idealistic fantasy nonsense, basically. Oh, this is a representative democracy. We do this every 4th year. This is how it's constructed. This is how laws are made, how decisions are made. Everything was such a lie because it was something dishonest. Of course, there is a system, a kind of a pattern to how decisions are made and so on, but there is so much bribery, corruption, and so many, psychopathic career people within politics. Kids are mature and ready to learn that, in my opinion. It is just a kind of a mind control, or just making it so uninteresting, or taking them along this sort of naive path of thinking, oh, this is how it ought to work, this representational democracy versus this democratic system, and so on, especially when it comes to the left and right, the blue and the red. I mean, just that kind of a level of understanding power, decision making, how the world runs, is nothing short of manipulation. I mean, red and blue, left and right, it's like, are you hungry? Press the blue button. Are you not hungry? Press the red button. It's on that level, and it's all coming from Freudian kind of philosophies from a small clique of people during the 19th century, and we still talk about issues and ideas through a leftish or rightish paradigm. So anywhere I see left and right mentioned, I understand what is being said. I understand you can look at it that way, but from me personally, I'm very suspicious of that. There is a kind of a brutal and naked way of understanding what's going on. So that's something I think he does in this book. why is this country doing this towards that country? Why is this being used as a reason for something? You see through it. You understand there's more to it, rather than being manipulated. And I think if kids were presented with this kind of approach, even if they have this sort of naive, idealistic explanation of how this country functions, I think this ought to be added, either by the parents or by the schools, but ultimately it's kind of the parents' how do you say, responsibility. And I'm not going to be idealistic here and say, you know, schools or, you know, society should do this and that. Parents are responsible, friends are responsible of bringing this up, so I really recommend this book. So that was that. In this video I just wanted to present how somebody from a time with, you know, where paper and pen wasn't something you could just pick up anywhere, where people couldn't read and write beside the, you know, leaders, the clerics and so on, how a man scribbled down his ideas, packed it in as dedicated to his prince, but it spread around to the people. And that's why we have that book today. That's why it exists. It was banned. So despite the ban, and imagine that ban in Italy during the medieval period, the Renaissance, imagine how hard it would be for common people or whoever spread around that book. I mean, it's not like today where you can just sort of, yeah, encrypt something on a drive and share. No torrents, nothing like that. And it's so fascinating, and it all comes from one man. So today we have many of these men. Now some are more prone to their own propaganda, information, to some disinformation and so on, but today we have so much of this. You know, just take a look on YouTube. There are so many news and truth channels. It never ends. But back in the day it wasn't that easy, and still his book kind of flies over all of it, because power and keeping power is the ultimate goal of power. Nobody is here for the common man besides satisfying the common man to a point where you don't have to care that much about it, when the big mass of common people is just a nice crowd that doesn't demand much and eats what they get served. Okay, enough about Niccolò Machiavelli. Take care and all the best. Ciao.